And the topic for today is the 3 biggest painting mistakes. So the plan is to teach you about these things. And if you can avoid these 3 mistakes, then you will be way ahead of the game, right? So sometimes, I spend a lot of time teaching, oh, here's how to do this atelier skill. Here's how to do that atelier skill. Here's what you need to do. But equally important in education is helping us find mistakes and avoid them. So we also need to know what not to do. What are we trying not to do? What do we want to avoid doing? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm excited to have you all here, and we'll get into it. Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm so glad to see you. Please take a minute to turn off your phones and kind of take a deep breath in and just really focus. We rarely get the opportunity to really focus on learning something new, and I hope that that's what you're here to do with me today. I'm a big fan of teaching or learning with like a cup of tea or coffee. So whatever you need to do to feel ready to learn, take 10 seconds right now and get your glass of water, get a pencil and paper for some notes, turn off your notifications, just be present here in this moment and come learn with us today. Okay, so there's some new faces and some returning faces, so good to see everybody. For those of you that this is your first session with us, hello, my name is Mandy, and I am the Director of School of Atelier Arts, and I am so excited to be here today. I'm an atelier trained artist, and I'm also a licensed art teacher, and I love helping students avoid silly mistakes. And so I hope that I can do that for all of you today. Okay, so I like to start off my classes by just asking a few different questions and, get us to start thinking about why are we here? What are we trying to learn? What's our intention for this class? And so my first question for you today is, are you trying to paint realistically? Are you looking at the old masters and wanting to be able to draw and paint like them, but maybe you're taking classes with somebody who paints like this, right? So maybe you've tried taking art classes and you just didn't get the results that you wanted. Or maybe your palette looks something like this. So are you trying to paint realistically with something that looks like this? And that's not going to help you. And we're going to talk about all the reasons why you need to set up your palette the right way. So this is a bad palette, and it's going to be really hard to paint realistically with this setup. So does this look like something that you've been trying to paint with? It might be one of the mistakes that you're making. And again, this is like my favorite picture ever. It just epitomizes to me how I felt before I found atelier training. Like, are you stuck? Like, do you just not have a process? Do you not know what to do next in your paintings? Do you start a painting, you're really excited, you have this idea, and you get partway through and you're like, right? Like you just get stuck. You don't know what to do. It's not what you hoped it would be, but you don't know like what step to take next. All right, because you don't have a process. All right, so if any of these are resonating with you, you're in luck because today we're going to talk about them. Okay, and atelier training, if these questions are resonating with you, you're probably looking for atelier training. And don't worry if this is the first time you've ever heard the word atelier, because I will explain all about it. But the only thing you really need to know is that atelier training is a very specific kind of training that's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years that teaches people how to draw and paint realistically. Okay, and then again, these courses, these free classes that we're offering, they're all part of our launch of the Atelier Painting Bootcamp, where we actually run a full-on atelier with students from all over the world, where you can come and train with us online, and I'll tell you all about that at the end. Okay, so the biggest mistake, and I mean, I cannot emphasize enough, this is the reason it's number one, is that students are trying to learn atelier drawing with an instructor that does not have atelier training. You have to have the right instructor if you're trying to learn these skills. Atelier skills require very specific training and a lot of it. And if you have an instructor that doesn't have that training, nobody can teach you what they don't know, right? And one of the great tragedies that I see in contemporary art education, I see this with young students, I see this with older students, but people start thinking, I just must not have it because I don't know how to draw and paint realistically already. I guess the talent fairy didn't get me and didn't bop me on the head. Oh, well, I guess there's nothing I can do about it. And that is so far from the truth. That is wrong. That is absolutely misinformation. And please get that thought out of your head, because anybody, and I mean absolutely anybody, can learn to draw and paint realistically with a atelier trained instructor who puts in the time and the hours and the work. Okay, so it's not something that some people have and other people don't have. Anybody can learn these skills. Anybody can do this. It's just a matter of going about it in a way that yields you the results that you're going after. If you want to draw and paint realistically, you need an atelier trained instructor. Okay, so again, just to review, the ateliers, they're these specialized art schools that teach people how to draw and paint realistically. Leonardo da Vinci did not wake up one day painting the Mona Lisa. He actually trained in an atelier for 10 years before he went on as an independent artist. Okay, so it's not something that he got bopped on the head. He had a lot of training from some really amazing artists in Florence. In order to create what he did, he learned what was already known under a master craftsman, right, who taught him, very in-depth knowledge. And this knowledge had been handed down from his master and his master's master, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, a lot of people don't realize that the contemporary atelier movement, so people like me who have our atelier training today, most of us can trace our training back to the French atelier, sometimes a few of the other ones like the Munich school, sometimes the Russian school, but the vast majority of Americans trace their atelier training into the French atelier. And the little pocket that's in Italy right now was because this woman, Nerina Simi, her father trained at the atelier in Paris, and then she maintained a studio after he passed. And that's why we have this Italian pocket as well. But again, a lot of this training goes all the way back to the French school. And I can actually, if I tell you who my teacher was and my teacher's teachers and my teacher's teachers, we've actually been able to figure out that the training that I have and that I'm giving to you today, and in a little piece of it anyways, goes all the way back to Delacroix. Okay, so we know that this knowledge is inherited, and each time it gets inherited, somebody adds to it. The events of the day influence things. The invention of new colors obviously influenced the Impressionists a fair amount, right? Many of those colors they were using didn't physically exist before that time period, right? So, every generation of artists kind of adds and builds to this knowledge. It's not so different from if you think about like math, right? So we have the Pythagorean theorem and we use Arabic numerals, and there's all these different pieces and these ideas that came from many different cultures that have been amalgamated into a general body of knowledge that we now train people in and pass down to students, generation after generation. Well, those skills exist in art too. It's just that the reason people think that art is something that you have or you don't have, or there's a talent fairy that's like bopping some of us on the head, is because this knowledge in the visual arts, this realistic drawing and painting training, almost went extinct. By the 1980s and 1990s, there were maybe just a small handful of places left in the world that were still teaching people these skills. So realism training fell out of favor, especially in Western countries. An exception was in Russia, but then the Americans during the Cold War were like, oh, communist realism bad, right? And, there was a lot of intentional tamping down on realism painting for a lot of political reasons. The wars, World War I and World War II, literally killed artists that were running ateliers at that time. Especially World War I, but by World War II, the last vestiges of some of that knowledge really got wiped out in World War II. So, just like this history of events was very unkind to painting in a way that music was able to keep their technical aspects together. Obviously, the math world, we continue to build on what we learned in math or science, but in the visual arts, we went backwards. We lost a lot of knowledge. And even still today, the ateliers are trying to piece a lot of this back together. Okay, so the thing is that nobody is self-taught, right? We're all, the people that have this learned it somewhere. And it's very advantageous. Like Picasso loved to talk about how, he learned how to draw and then he spent a lifetime learning not to draw. But his father, guess what? Trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And Picasso did bark plates, but he tried to present himself to the world as some self-taught, hero of individualism when he had a lot of training. He had an immense amount of training, and he was one of the few people that had training during the 20th century when that knowledge was nearly lost. So there's a lot of reasons politically why the artists that did have the training were pretending that they were self-taught. Wyeth, comes to mind. His father and grandfather were atelier trained artists, and it's just that his atelier training was handed down from the grandfather to the father and then to Andrew Wyeth. So Andrew Wyeth is not self-taught. I cannot stand it when people say that he was self-taught. He had access to some of the best knowledge that existed in the world at the time that he was painting. But it makes a much better story to pretend that this person in the middle of nowhere in the Midwest, could suddenly just draw and paint magically super well. But it wasn't magic. He had atelier training and he got it through his family lineage. Okay, I'm like really harping on this point. Are there any questions that you have about atelier training and about how finding the right instructor and an instructor that has atelier training, that's the key. If you want to paint like what you see on the screen here, you need to find somebody with atelier training to help you, because this knowledge doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not something that you're going to self-teach yourself. This is thousands of years of things that people have figured out. Like, imagine if your music teacher just handed you a trumpet and was like, oh, do what you feel for the next 10 years. Like, are you going to be writing a symphony that, and discovering all the notes? Probably not. So there's a great advantage in learning what's known technically in a field in order to advance it forward. Okay, so I'm very passionate about this topic. So are there any questions about that before we carry on? Okay, so Jeremy's talking about how the Wyeth family's from the Brandywine family in Pennsylvania and Delaware. I thought that he was in, didn't he have a home in Wisconsin for a period of time, or Minnesota maybe, I thought? Isn't that where all his Helga pictures were? But thank you for calling me out on it, Jeremy. I'll have to double check my sources. So an American painter that is known to be isolationist and often regaled as self-taught is not self-taught. So I'm going to edit to that statement. But thank you, Jeremy. Okay. All right, so again, I went over this a little bit in the other workshop, but just for everybody that's here today, I just want to briefly talk about what the atelier training is and how it works. So often in the atelier, you start by drawing and then you progress to painting. You're often working from casts of, famous sculptures, and the idea is that you're learning good design from those sculptures at the same time that you're practicing your drawing and painting skills. And then what you're doing next is you're taking the ideas that you learned in drawing and applying them to painting. So this is what's called engrisage, and it just means painting in black and white. And so what's happening here is that you're still kind of in a drawing mode in the sense that you're thinking about values, except for now you have to control the paint at the same level that you can control your charcoal or your pencil, if that's your medium of choice. So it's actually quite difficult to get paint to do what you want it to do. And this kind of jump for students is often a big jump because they can often see from their practice in drawing that, oh, this value is off, but they don't have the paint handling skills quite yet developed enough to be able to get a really subtle shift when they're painting. And again, this is why having an atelier trained instructor can help you through some of these aggravating moments. So really, it's about efficiency of learning. If you have X number of hours to learn how to draw and paint realistically, you're going to get a lot further with someone coaching you than you are on your own, as long as that person has atelier training. Okay, another project that's kind of a transitional project is called a warm cool project. So this painting was actually done with only 3 colors of paint. This is a burnt sienna, an ultramarine blue, and a white. And the idea behind this is that by limiting the palette, that's only 3 colors, it helps you start adjusting to these concepts of warm and cool in your painting. So starting to think about the temperature of your paint without having like 100 pigments on your palette yet. Okay, so the idea is just a slow build up into colors so that you don't get overwhelmed. You need to understand what the colors already on your palette are capable of doing before you start adding more colors in. Okay, and master copy. So this is a master copy of a Velázquez painting, but it's enormously important part of atelier training. And not just when you're a student, but if you look at the journals of the old master, if you look in the Delacroix journals, and so on and so forth, you'll see that they're copying all the time, right? So it's not something that you do once and, oh, I did a master copy, I'm done. And the reason for that is it's like playing a song that another composer has written, right? So you learn a lot about that composer, you learn a lot about music, you learn a lot about the technicality of your instrument and why they made certain choices when you play a song that somebody else composed. And in this case, what you're doing is you're basically painting a picture that somebody else has composed, but you're practicing how to mix your paint, how to control your paint, how to control your values. You're starting to understand certain problems that the artist has solved in paint that maybe you've struggled with before. Like, oh, well, how do I get a highlight on the nose? Well, in order for the dot on the nose to look like a highlight, what's underneath it has to be darker than the highlight. So it's not uncommon when people first start to learn how to paint where they'll be like, oh, the nose is bright, and they'll make it a really, really light, almost white color. And then they'll put a highlight on and be like, how come my highlight doesn't look right? But it only looks like a highlight if something that's underneath it is darker, right? And that's just one of 100 things that you could learn from just this little segment of this master copy. So this is why it's so essential and so important. And like, in my opinion, it is the biggest linchpin in learning how to paint, is if you can not just make master copies, but make good master copies, make master copies that are actually good copies, competent technical copies, which requires you to have a good palette, which we're going to talk about in a minute, have the right pigments, understanding your color theory, which we're going to talk about tomorrow in Sunday's workshop. So there's a lot that you have to know and practice in order to even make a competent copy of a master copy. So it's, some people are like, oh, I don't want to copy, I want to make real art. It's like, well, if you want to learn the skills, the most efficient way to learn the skills are to copy the old masters and to copy them well. Okay, and lucky for you, right now you're getting some quality atelier training from an atelier trained instructor. So, many of the things that I'm telling you about have been handed down to me through this series of atelier instructors going back to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Okay, before I go on to mistake number 2, does anybody have any questions about making sure, like, if you want to learn atelier skills, first of all, you need to know the word atelier, and you need to, if you know that word, you have a higher likelihood of finding an atelier trained artist. And there are some absolutely wonderful atelier trained artists teaching today that are much more accessible because of the internet than they've ever been before. But also there are, as atelier training becomes more popularized and it's kind of becoming trendy almost, there's a lot of people who are starting to use that word that actually don't have a connection to this training, right? They may be working realistically, but it's not atelier training. And so it's really important that you vet your instructors, like go look up, where did they study? Where did they train? How long did they train for? What was that lineage? Does it go back to, a school that has the skill set that you're looking for? It's a key part of making sure that you get good training is having a good instructor. Okay, so mistake number 2 is using the wrong materials. Now, I say this and I mean this, but there's actually 2 mistakes within this one mistake. One is not using the wrong materials, one is using the wrong materials, and the other is obsessing over materials and not getting to the learning of how to paint part. Okay, I see students fall in both ways. So it's important to know enough to avoid the bad materials, but also, as I go through this, I don't want you to start obsessing so much on materials that you think, oh, I have to have the one true paintbrush or I'll never paint. That's not the way it works, but there are some materials that are going to help you, and there are some materials that are going to create additional challenges for you to get where you're wanting to go. And so if you have a good setup to start, that means less friction in the organization of your palette and your pigments and your brushes, and more mental energy for learning how to paint, which is actually quite challenging just in itself, right? So if you're trying to learn how to draw and paint realistically, you don't want to be distracted by logistics, right? So having a system in place with materials that are creating a streamlined process for you while you're painting is going to immensely improve your ability to learn how to paint. Okay, so what's wrong with this palette? Does anybody want to take a few guesses in the chat here? Like, what do you see wrong with this palette? And there's a lot to choose from, so feel free to pick any that you see. You can give me more than one answer too, but what are you seeing here, and why might it be wrong? All right, Kelly's saying too many colors. There's certainly a lot of colors on here. I would say it's not necessarily that there's too many colors, but that there could be better color choices on the palette for sure. And mixing colors on the source instead of separately. So I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, Jeremy. Can you clarify that? Oh, like kind of mixing them all together instead of like having separation between them? Keep them coming, guys. There's a lot to pick from here. I want you to see what you know, see what you're seeing. And it's okay to guess too. Like it's okay, even if you make a off guess, who cares? We're all internet strangers here. But give it a go. We have a quiet, shy Saturday morning group. Oh, okay. So Jeremy is saying, oh, don't you scoop away? So this is a really good point. If you look carefully on the palette, you can see that the white especially has contaminated the paint piles, and it's already like getting in there. So often when you're mixing, you'll take a palette knife and pull, with a clean palette knife, the color away so you don't contaminate your piles. Yes, absolutely, Jeremy. That is definitely wrong with this paint. And a lot of brights. Thank you, Jacqueline. Yes. So we have a lot of brights, but in particular, I want to point out how every color mixed on this palette is very, very light in value, right? So, Jacqueline's saying brights. And in order to paint realistically, you need to be able to mix what we call a string. So when we start mixing paint, we tend to mix a color that we think we need, but we'll mix a light version, a medium version, a dark version of it, because we often need a whole value. So when you're drawing, right, you don't make everything one gray. You need dark colors and light colors, and that doesn't change just because you go to paint. But do you see how if we were to use the paint that got mixed up on this palette, it would be the equivalent of a gray drawing? It's like all basically the same value. There's no range between light and dark on this palette. And Judy's saying need more neutrals. Yes, absolutely. There's like barely almost a neutral close to the thumb hole on the palette. But other than that, like these are really chromatic colors. And unless you're painting something like flowers, that's like a pure chromatic note, almost every color is at least slightly neutralized, right? And especially skin tones. If you're tones, the reason skin tones have a reputation for being difficult to paint is because they're actually pretty close to neutral, and they're just like a little bit pinky neutral, a little bit green neutral, a little bit orange neutral, right? So if you don't have control over the chroma, the intensity of your paint, right now on this palette, that purple, even when it's mixed with the white, is very chromatic, right? That green is very chromatic. There's no neutralizing of these colors. If you're ever painting grass or landscapes, you'll find that when you take your green, often the first thing you're going to do is start adding some red into it to neutralize it, because there's rarely a pure chroma note in nature. Occasionally, but rarely. And Naveed's saying a limited palette is a good idea at first, or earth colors. So we can talk about that. So yes, we briefly touched on, there's a lot of colors here. Some ateliers will teach almost primarily only a Zorn palette. And a Zorn palette is a red, white, black, and yellow. And that's a very, very limited palette, and it helps keep students, it helps them to neutralize their paints more because it's such a limited palette. When you don't have a lot of chroma notes on your palette, then it's hard to make things too chromatic. So that is a choice that some ateliers make, or some will do like a, I don't know, like a adapted Zorn palette where they'll add a blue in there. But yeah, having a limited palette is definitely something that ateliers take advantage of, because the more colors that are on your palette, the more thinking you have to do, and the more organized you have to be, and the more information you have to process. And so starting with a limited palette, especially when you're learning, is going to help you. Okay. All right. So yes, these are all good things. I'm going to point out a few additional things that we haven't talked about. For one, I want to talk about how awful these brushes are. Like maybe that yellow handled brush would be fine. It looks like it might be a bristle brush to paint with, but that middle brush is actually a watercolor brush. It's a very floppy, loose brush, as you're going to have a very difficult time sticking it in your oil paint and then putting it on your canvas and having the paint go where you intend for it to go, because it's such a soft, loose bristle. It's just going to splay when you push it against canvas. It's not intended to hold heavy oil paint and splot it on canvas. So that's definitely a problem. Also, there's different shapes of brushes. Well, which one's the right shape? And I've seen ateliers use lots of different shaped brushes. But I would say that the kind of brush that I see dominant in most ateliers is what's called a filbert. And so a filbert is if you take a brush that's like flat, that's cut off. So if it's cut off all the way, it's a flat. But if it's cut off all the way and it just has like a little bit of curve on each side, that's called a filbert. And I would say, at least in this moment in time, with the many ateliers that I work with, that would be the most common shape of a brush to use. And we can see here that none of these brushes are that shape either. Also, the kind of paint that's on this palette is acrylic paint. And it's not that you can't paint realistically with acrylic paint. I see some people with atelier training that successfully do paint in acrylic paint. But when you're learning how to paint, it takes a long time. So once you have a lot of atelier training, sure, you can go a lot more quickly. You have the experience. A lot of things are on autopilot for you. You're much more efficient in how you mix your colors and put them on canvas. But the problem is that acrylic paints dry really, really fast. And atelier training, when you're learning it, is very, very slow. And so if you mix up all your strings with acrylic paint, they're most likely going to be dry before you even finish mixing your strings, let alone put it onto canvas. So one solution to this, if you're like just really determined to stick to acrylic paints, is to use what's called open acrylics. They stay wet longer. But if you're even thinking about it, if you're serious about atelier training, just make the good faith leap into oil paints. I know that it can be scary for some students. There's, again, a lot of bad information about oil paint out there. So, for example, paint is basically a pigment, and it has a binder in it that holds the pigment together. So acrylic paint is actually plastic, and it's plastic that holds the pigment together, the little pigment particles together. Oil paint is the exact same pigment. So if you're working with a cadmium red acrylic paint and a cadmium red oil paint, it's the exact same pigment, but the binder of oil paint is oil. It's vegetable oil. And for me personally, I feel a lot more confident painting with a binder that's vegetable oil than plastics, which are relatively new and we know have a ton of chemicals in them. So oil painting gets like a bad rap for a lot of reasons, but like a lot of people think that the paint itself is somehow more toxic. And depending on which pigment color you're buying, yes, some pigments are more toxic than other pigments. Earth pigments are literally dirt. So like a burnt sienna is literally dirt mixed with oil, right? But the thing is that acrylic isn't suddenly safe. It's the same pigment. So you wouldn't eat cadmium paint, whether it's acrylic or oil paint. Okay, so the acrylic paint. And then the last thing I want to point out is that this is a raw palette. And what do I mean by that? This palette has not been treated. And so what that means, if you take oil paint and you put it on a raw palette that has not been treated appropriately, it's going to suck up all your oil paint, all the oil from your paint, right? And it's going to dry out your paint very quickly, and it's going to make your paint tacky, and it's going to be very upsetting to you to try to work with when you're trying to learn all these other things, okay? So how do you treat a palette? So often what artists will do is they will take a little bit of linseed oil and they will wipe the palette, and they'll let it dry, do it again, let it dry, do it again. So build up, a patina of 4 or 5 layers of oil paint, because once the palette soaks in a lot of that oil, then it'll stop sucking the oil from your paint once it gets saturated enough. Now, that being said, warning, 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 the School of Atelier Arts is not responsible for your studio safety in any way, shape, or form. But I want to point out that if you have an oil-soaked rag, let's say that you were, treating some palettes, if you leave it crumpled, it can spontaneously combust. So it's very, very important that you always immediately throw rags in an outside garbage bin, flat, never crumpled, away from anything flammable. And again, School of Atelier Arts is not responsible for this, but it seems like something that people should know. It's funny because one of my classmates, when I was in atelier training, he was working on a construction site, and the construction site burned down because one of his coworkers left an oil-soaked rag from when they were doing some sort of finishing work inside the house, and it burnt the thing down. Okay, so no crumpled oil-soaked rags. That's a bad idea. But it's not because oil is inherently dangerous. Like linseed oil is literally a vegetable oil, right? It's that there's a chemical reaction that can occur when you have a lot of oil soaked on a rag. Okay. Ooh, Marilyn paints with earth pigments from France. That sounds delightful. When you're in the atelier world long enough, people do make their own paints and, various other things. And I'm always really impressed with people that make paints. I knew a lady who would collect dirt everywhere she went and make earth pigments out of it, right? So I like that, like the connectedness. And I also, for a while, I had vision for making like a pigment garden, because there's like certain vegetables you can grow that will make, you can make pigment for oil paint out of. That's been on my mind. Someday I'll have a pigment garden. Oh, so Bonnie has a good question. What about water-based oils? Just don't do it. Absolutely not. They are incredibly aggravating to get to do what you want them to do. The only advantage is that people are afraid of oil paint, right? But like, you don't need to be afraid of oil paint. Like, you paint, and then like you can literally wash your brushes with soap and water. Like, it doesn't have to be a big deal. Like, wipe off as much of the oil paint as you can, wash them in soap and water. Like, people are so afraid of cleaning up. Scrape off the extra pigment on your palette, you put it in a paper towel, and then you can just take a towel and wipe the leftover pigment on your palette, and it'll become part of that patina and start building up a smooth surface on your palette. You guys don't have to overthink it. There's so much bad information about oil painting, and some of that bad information is that somehow it's like this awful, impossible thing, and that we need these water-based oil paints. And no, you don't. Just use oil paints, and use good quality. If you can afford, like, try to avoid the student brand oil paint. You really want to invest in the professional oil paint. And the difference between the student paint and the professional paint is that the student grade paint has fillers in it. So the expensive part of pigment is that the expensive part about oil paint is the pigment. And so what they do for the student grade paints is they put in fillers like silica and other things to make the pigment kind of spread out a little bit more so they don't have to use as much of it in there. Whereas a professional grade oil paint more or less is just the linseed oil or sometimes walnut oil, or sometimes they use a different oil, and pigment. There's no additional filler in there. Like, you do not want extra filler in your paint. So please get real oil paint. You don't need a ton of colors either. So like in the Atelier Bootcamp, I have like a full like shopping list with links, and it's not that many pigments. I think I have 5 pigments on the list, right? So you don't need a million different kinds of paint. You need good paint in a small number of colors. But excellent question. Thank you for bringing that up, Bonnie. Okay, are there any other questions about paint or using the wrong materials when oil painting? You got it, Bonnie. Okay, like this, like honestly, in the Atelier Painting Bootcamp that I'm going to talk about at the end, like I have like pages and pages and pages of just information for setting up to help make sure that you do things the right way and don't make things harder for yourself. Okay, so I got ahead of myself. Okay, we talked about the brushes. So the shape of the brushes is not ideal, and don't use watercolor brushes for oil paints. And this Pastelomania, we talked about how everything was the same value, and that without a full value range, you're not going to be able to paint realistically. Thor's asking, will I talk more about paint tomorrow? Yes. Yes. So tomorrow's class is on mixing any color that you want the right way the first time, right? And so we're going to do a deep dive into the elements of color and how we go about mixing them to make sure that you get the right color every time. And so also, if you have any more questions specifically about color mixing, color theory, or like particular pigments that you have questions about, tomorrow's a good class to come to. Okay, and then we talked about the wrong paint. Okay, so don't use acrylic paint. Just you put on your big kid pants and go get some oil paint. It's worth it. It's amazing. If you're trying to learn these skills with bad paint, whether that's not oil paint or a compromised oil paint or student grade paint, it just makes things harder. Like, just get the right materials for the right job. And the raw palette, you know, if you don't treat your palette before you start using a wood palette, it's going to suck up all the oil out of your paint. You know, some people ask me, well, what about a glass palette? What about a plastic palette, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to talk briefly, since we're talking about using the right materials. You want a wood palette. They're super cheap. You can make one, you know, just by cutting a piece of wood into a shape and putting a hole in it for your thumb. Okay. And you can buy them offline for just like a few dollars. Like, it's not an expensive thing to buy, and it makes your painting life so much better. So if you have a plastic palette, the problem is when you're mixing colors with your palette knife, the palette knife edge is somewhat sharp and the plastic gets scratched up really easily. And the more you use the palette, the more scratched it gets and the more difficult it becomes to mix paint. And then as you're mixing colors, like a little bit of, say, blue will get stuck in that crack. And then all of a sudden you're trying to mix a new color and that blue comes up into your new color because it was embedded in that crack. And it's very aggravating and very frustrating and very unnecessary. Whereas on the wood palette, it actually gets better and smoother every time you use it, because once you take your paint off at the end of the day and you just wipe the excess paint around on your palette, it creates a patina each and every day. And so your palette actually gets better and more lovely every single time that you use it, with a smoother and smoother mixing surface. Now, that being said, some people do prefer mixing on glass for a variety of reasons. I did train at one atelier where they had a big glass table. Basically, everybody had a big glass table in front of them. The advantage of that is that just the amount of space you have for mixing colors. And so that is an advantage, because sometimes if you're holding a wood palette, you'll run out of space, but you're in the zone and you don't want to like clean off your palette, or you just need more space or whatever. And then you're kind of compromising and your colors are getting tainted a little bit because you're trying to mix too many colors and you don't have enough space. So the glass table method is good for that. But I dislike the glass table method because when you're looking down at your table mixing color, and then you're looking up at your painting, like this doesn't seem like a big deal to people who are new to atelier training, like that much motion and that much differentiation of sight. But that takes a lot of brain power to do. Whereas if I can just hold my palette right next to my painting, do you see how I'm not having to lose sight of my painting every time I want to mix a color? And that, for me, the efficiency of doing that and not losing my train of thought is well worth the palette. But you can make it work both ways. That's the thing with atelier training, is that you can learn 100 skills, right? And there are some things I learned in the atelier that just didn't vibe with me. I didn't like the way this one thing was done or that one thing was done. And that's fine. Like, I don't use those particular techniques in my work right now. But if I ever come across a visual painting problem down the road and that I can't solve with my preferred techniques, I still have those in my back pocket, right? Like, oh, okay, well, I don't normally like to paint with a really tiny brush, but in this case, I'm going to pull out that tiny brush, and because this particular painting is warranting that. Okay, all right, so any other questions on materials before we go to mistake number 3? And we spent a lot of time on that. We covered a lot, so we covered a lot more than I actually intended to. I meant that to be a little bit more of a brief overview because we still have this other thing that I want to talk about. Okay, I'm just going to plow on through. At any time, you can ask your questions, and I promise I'll get to them. And if for any reason I don't get to them right now, I will stay until the very end, and I promise to answer your questions. All right. So mistake number 3, not having systems for painting. Okay, so sometimes people get excited about the idea of painting. They want to paint realistically, but they don't have a process for how to get from where they are to where they need to go. And if you don't have kind of these footholds along the way, what happens is, okay, especially when you're learning how to paint realistically, you might get through stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3, and then all of a sudden something goes wrong with stage 3. But if you have a system, you can backtrack very safely to stage 2, figure out what went wrong, and then continue back up to stage 3. If you don't have a system, what happens is you start here and you go whoop up here, and then something goes wrong, and the next thing you know, you've made a huge mess on your canvas and you're all the way back at the beginning and you have to restart. Okay, it's very inefficient. So it's kind of like going on like getting in your car, but not having any idea where you're trying to go or why you're trying to go there. Like, you're going to go in circles or whatever. It's just like you want a path and an idea. You want a conception in your head about what the stages of your painting is going to look like before you even start your painting. Okay, so for example, we spent a lot of time talking about palettes. There's a system for your palette that you can use that will help you keep your palette clean and help you learn more efficiently. Now, especially those of you who are here that are art teachers, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to insist that your students set up their palette the exact same way every time. One, for their benefit, so they're not wasting time being like, where did I put the red on my palette today? Is it here? Is it here? I don't remember. You know, that uses up brain power. We don't want to waste brain power. We need every ounce of brain power we have to solve the painting problem in front of us. We don't want to be wasting it trying to find the paint on our palette. Also, if you're a school teacher and you're teaching this in your classroom, like I'm a licensed teacher, I work with art teachers all over the country, actually all over the world. I work with art teachers all over the world. And, you know, if you have a class of 20 students and they all have their palette set up a different way, it's really hard for you to teach them, because then you have to find where their paint is every time you sit down with a new student before you can help them with their painting. So it's good for you as an individual to always have your paint in the same place. And it is especially important if you're teaching others how to paint, that you have a system so that everybody is doing it the same way to make teaching easier for you. In this case, there is a system to this palette. You'll notice at the bottom is the lightest colors and they go to the darkest colors. The reason for this is it helps keep your piles of paint from getting contaminated with the piles of paint next to it. If I have the black right next to my white, you know, they're close enough where they're going to start contaminating each other, right? Whereas keeping the distance between the lighter values and the darker values help keep the piles neat and tidy and clean, which will help you create neat and tidy, clean color notes when you go to mix your colors. Also, a lot of people don't know this, but you want your paint piles to be on the outside of your palette. The center of your palette is for mixing the paint, and you need as much of that space as possible to mix your paint, because it sucks when you don't have enough space when you're mixing paint, okay? So you put the piles of paint on the outside of the palette from light to dark. Okay, so paint goes on the outside, you mix the paint on the inside, all right? Okay, and I already mentioned this, but the order of the paint going from the lightest to the darkest. All right, so this is just one system. This is one of hundreds of systems that Atelier trained people use, right? So, you know, sometimes people get so excited, they're like, I just want to paint realistically, and they like put paint all over their palette. Like, this is one system, and just using this system will help you be a better painter. And Atelier training is basically comprised of hundreds and hundreds of different systems for approaching different problems. In this case, the problem is, where do I put the paint on my palette? This is the system that gives you an answer. Okay, and so once you have your paint on your palette, and we talked a lot about this in the How to Paint class, but you need a painting process, okay? You can't just be like, I'm gonna start with a blank canvas. Like, people somehow think that you start in like one corner of your canvas and then you work to the other end of your canvas and voila, you have a painting. Like, maybe if you're working from a photograph, that can work for you, but that's not the way Atelier trained artists paint. And that's not the way we take in information. That's not the way we organize visual information. We need a process, because your eye can take in massive amounts of information because you have two eyes. You're actually seeing in 3D, right? Things look dimensional to us because we're getting two views, right? One from each eye. But when we are painting, we're taking the 3D world and we're editing out massive amounts of that information and being very selective on what we actually keep to put in our 2D painting, right? We cannot actually put everything into a 2D painting that we see in a 3D world. That's not possible. So we're like, painters are great editors, and we have to make very judicious decisions about, okay, what am I including? What am I not including? And I'm not talking about objects. Sometimes I'm talking about highlights. Sometimes I'm talking about details. Sometimes I'm talking about a color note. You know, our eyes can actually see lighter, brighter brights and darker darks than we have pigment that can, like, our pigments are not as light as what our eyes are capable of seeing. If you have a light on in a room and you look at it, it's much brighter than a white pigment. If you hold up a white piece of paper, or I have this like box here. All right, so we think of this as white. Oh, it's so bright. But compare it to your light bulb, and this is like 3 or 4 shades darker than a light. We just don't have pigment that can be a light. The brightest pigment we have is this value. The same is true for intensities of colors. And I'm going to talk a lot about this tomorrow, so I don't want to go too far into it today. So we're running out of time, and I still have so much to share with you. But the point is that you can't include everything in your painting, and your eyes are going to take in lots of information. Remember that cat being stuck in a tree that we saw at the beginning? Like, what happens, why we get stuck, is because we don't know how to organize that visual information that we're seeing, because we think that we can include all of it in our paintings, and we can't. It's not possible. Okay, so here is one process for painting a master copy specifically that I teach students and that I use in my own practice. So if you want to sit down and paint a master copy, the first thing you want to do is transfer the drawing of the master copy to canvas. All right, then the next stage, so we talked about those footholds, right? Climbing up. All right, so okay, we're going to transfer our drawing. The next stage is what's called a wipeout. It's a way for you to key the values in an underpainting. So you're using one color of paint only, and you are just pulling out the lights and, excuse me, and allowing the darks to be dark. And this is called keying your painting. It's about you know, setting up, where are the lights, where are the darks, where's my brightest bright, where's my darkest dark. So we're keying the values. And we're not even thinking about color yet, right? Because every color has a value, a chroma, and a hue, I'm going to talk a lot about that tomorrow. And so by separating out value, that's now one thing we don't have to think about when we're going into painting the color. The value's already been decided. So now we only have to decide the chroma and the hue going forward. So do you see how we can ease the massive amount of information that we're taking in by kind of separating it out, breaking it down into pieces, and having a process for painting? Okay, then color. There's lots of ways to put color down. Different ateliers teach it differently. I have found by far the most success I've had with teaching painting skills to my students has been with the tiling technique. And what tiling does is you're basically looking at one small space, spending a lot of time getting that exact color, and then creating the next tile next to it. So on this pair, you can see on the far left in that shadow area, it's kind of like a reddy brown. And then it shifts a little bit more towards a greeny red, and then a little bit more green. And then eventually it shifts all the way into yellows. And then at the very far edge, it shifts back into green again. So it's a way for you to look at just one strip in your painting and ask yourself, what is the color movement? Okay, so how is the color shifting? Oh, it's shifting from red to green to yellow to green. How's the value shifting? It's going from dark to light to just a tiny bit dark again. So these are systems that are going to help you get accurate color when you are painting. And again, we're going to talk a ton about mixing colors and what value, chroma, hue mean and how to use them efficiently in our training tomorrow. Okay, so I just want to show you a little bit before and after atelier training. I always like to share my own work with students to just show you like how far you can go. So Marguerite has a really great question. Is the tracing a form of shortcut? I was taught not to trace, but to draw with grids and plumb lines. This is an excellent, excellent question. So Marguerite, I see it both ways in ateliers. Some ateliers are like, we'll never ever trace. You should do the whole painting from drawing into painting. However, I have found that the most efficient way for me to teach students who are really eager to learn drawing and painting skills is that when I try to make them learn drawing first, they resist me. When I teach them a process for painting first, and then they understand, so by tracing it, it eliminates having to learn drawing first, right? You can go right into the painting part and the painting learning, which there's a whole lot there to learn. And once they do that and they want to start painting things like this cup or something like that, then they realize, okay, well, now I need to learn drawing skills, and they're much more open to learning the drawing skills. So most ateliers will make you draw for a year or more before ever letting you touch paint, sometimes 2 years before they'll let you touch paint. But I found that that creates a lot of frustration and aggravation for students. And so I've created this method for teaching people how to paint at a really high level to start their training. And then by using those master copies, they don't have to learn drawing in order to learn the painting part. And then once they master some of those paint handling skills and some of those color skills, then they're very eager to go into the drawing process. So that's why it's kind of like in teaching jargon, like a flipped classroom of sorts, right? So that's why I teach it that way, is because I found that my students stay more engaged, they get better results, and they are getting what they think they want, even though everybody needs to learn how to draw, but they just don't want to learn drawing when this like siren song of color is over here in painting. So I find that if I teach them that part first, then I have very committed students for the drawing part. Okay, so I just wanted to show you some before and after. So this is a painting on the right that's in progress from a while ago. And the painting on the left is one that I did before. Now, I'd always been interested in atelier training. I did my very best to try to teach myself and be self-taught. But you can tell that the donuts on the left are like kind of cartoony, right? They don't have this believability about them. They don't have the subtlety in neutrals, in value range and things like that. And you can see, even though this painting on the right is unfinished, I chose it because they're both kind of chromatic paintings. I thought that they were a good comparison. But you can see how much more knowledge and in-depth understanding of how to paint is there. And also the one on the left was done from a photograph. The one on the right obviously is being done from life. So having atelier training, it opens up a world of opportunities for you. And I really believe atelier training is about giving you as many tools to have in your toolbox as you can so that you can choose to use them as needed or not use them as needed. Picasso was very well trained, but he often didn't use many of the tools that he had because they weren't of interest to him later on in his career. Okay, so a few questions about atelier training I get a lot. Do I have to be good already to learn atelier skills? No, you do not. Like, what's the point of coming to train with somebody if you already know how to do it? That's not the point. I don't care where you are in your painting journey. I don't care if you've never picked up a paintbrush before in your life. I know that I can teach you how to draw and paint because it's a series of technical skills that anybody can learn if they have a process like we were talking about, and if they have an instructor that has the knowledge that, you're not going to learn from somebody who doesn't have the knowledge. And if you, excuse me, are using the appropriate materials for what you're trying to achieve. So I hope that that's what you've gotten out of today's lecture, is that these three things matter. If you want to learn atelier training, you need to learn from an atelier trained person, you need processes that are proven, and you need the correct materials. Okay, and I kind of covered this already, but why master copies? Because they will teach you the most efficiently. It's amazing what you will learn from them. It's like stepping into the shoes of artists that died 500 years ago. Like, you can start to see what they were seeing and think how they were thinking just by seeing how they solved different problems. If you've ever tried to paint a portrait before and then you do a master copy of a Velázquez, all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's how he did XYZ. Okay, so the highlight, if you look at this highlight on the eye, it actually goes above the lash line. I didn't know that until I copied this Velázquez painting, right? Like, these things that the highlight, in order to get the vibe and the feel of that spectral highlight, that it actually transcends these ideas of lines that we have stuck in our head. Okay, and so the next question I almost always get is, so how can I start learning? Well, obviously you're here in this class learning from an atelier trained person right now. So you're learning good basis, good foundations right now. But if you want to continue learning, the School of Atelier Arts has resources for you. We have free blogs. If you haven't been to our website, I encourage you to check out our blog. We have a lot written there, a lot of technical information in there. We also have worksheets to help you train, especially in drawing and color. And of course, we just launched this week our official painting bootcamp. So I get asked this question so much, like, Mandy, are you teaching classes? Mandy, when are you going to teach classes? And so this painting bootcamp, I'm finally doing it. I'm finally offering online instruction for anybody who wants to learn it. So you can come learn with me online in our bootcamp. You can discover painting systems that make things easier. You'll learn how to set up your studio the right way. You'll learn all sorts of really important information that will help you for a lifetime of painting. And you'll learn good painting techniques. So if you show up with oil or water-based oils in my class, you will be hearing from me immediately that you need to get the appropriate materials. I'm not going to let you do silly things in my class. And of course, we want to stop getting stuck. Okay, so in this boot camp, I critique twice a week. Myself or another atelier trained instructor will be critiquing twice a week. And it's amazing because this is the most important part, because in the boot camp, I have tons of really detailed videos, tons of really detailed resources to help guide you in the process. But what you really need is feedback from somebody who is seeing what you've done and able to give you appropriate feedback, keep you on the right track, keep you from going on the wrong track. That's the value of training with an atelier trained person. Okay, so the investment is $500 a month, and this is a freaking bargain. I spent tens and tens and tens of thousands of dollars to get atelier training. I had to leave the profession. I moved across the country. I was waitressing night shifts. It's amazing. Like, I'm actually really jealous of all of you right now, because you can stay in your home, you can stay in your career, and you can get some serious atelier training for a really reasonable price. Like, if you think about it, it's like the same as like when I was training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, like this was what I paid, for monthly classes. So if you want world-class art training, it is within your grasp. Okay, so what do you get in the boot camp for your $500 a month? Well, you get critiques. This is huge. You're getting guidance where your work is being discussed and adjusted, and you're being helped to stay on track. There's 15 extensive video lessons, and for those of you, excuse me, for those of you who may have seen my bark plate drawing class, and I see a question about, do I have a drawing boot camp? There's a bark plate drawing class on YouTube. If you Google it, I used to work with an organization called the Da Vinci Initiative, and I made this class with them. It's free. It's on YouTube. So if you want drawing instruction, or if you are curious about, well, what's the quality of the painting instruction going to be like? I taught that class. You can watch it for free, and you can see if you'd like that level of in-depth, thorough instruction for your painting. Okay, you get a master copy bundle too, because not all master copies are created equal. And especially when you're first learning how to paint, you want an approachable master copy that will work with the palette I am teaching you. So it's really a key part of any education endeavor, and many of you here are art teachers, is setting your students up for success. And that's what I've done in this boot camp. I'm making sure that at every step, when you're purchasing your materials, when you're figuring out your master copy, when you're starting your painting, that I have anticipated the mistakes that you might make and headed them off to make sure that you have a smooth experience and a solid learning journey. That's a fun thing to say, learning journey. So like I said, you get in the boot camp, there's an art supply list with links. There's how to set up your studio. There's a whole thing on studio safety. How to print your master copies, how to set up your studio in natural light, or if you don't have a window that you can use, how to set up with artificial light, how to prep your palette, etc., etc. And I think one of the most valuable things about the boot camp that I'm the most excited about is that it is a community. So basically, in this online learning software, you can talk to your other classmates. If you can't make it to the video critiques, like the live critiques that we have in the painting bootcamp, you can post your painting in progress to the feed in the class and get a written critique from Atelier instructors. You can chat just one-on-one with a classmate. So let's say, many of you here today, maybe Thor and Magritte want to talk because they both live in the same place, right? They can reach out and have their own private chat just like you can in any other social media platform. And so also in the bootcamp, you get the first notice on all of the special classes that we do. Everything's all scheduled in there for you. And it's really actually pretty cool. I'm super excited to finally be launching this class because I've been asked for years to teach painting. So I am super excited to be able to offer this. Now, somebody was asking about drawing class, like, is there a drawing boot camp? Yes and no. So I still critique drawings in the boot camp. So especially if, like, let's say I strongly encourage everybody to do the master copy first in the boot camp. But let's say you get through, a master copy or two, and you're at that point that I was talking about earlier where you're ready to really take your drawing seriously, then we'll set up like a little still life for you, like help you set up one that you'll have success with, and you'll get drawing critiques on how to pursue that. So, even though it's the painting boot camp, it's the painting boot camp because that's what everybody wants. But there's no such thing as learning to paint without learning to draw, and you will get critiqued on your drawings too. I am way over schedule. I want to make sure to answer any of your questions. I'm here for you if you have more questions. Well, actually, the most important part is if you want to enroll, I'm going to put the link up here. So if you want to enroll in this boot camp, these are all you get. You get the community, the master copy bundle, the instructions, the video instruction, the critiques, the written critiques. And if you click on this link, it'll take you to a page that looks like this. And essentially, there's a few steps to enrolling in the boot camp. So you want to click on the page. If you choose to purchase the boot camp, it will ask you to create an account, and this will take you to the learning software that we use to host the boot camp. So you need to create an account for the learning software, and then it'll allow you to purchase it within that space. So there's 3 steps if you want to enroll in the boot camp.